For those who don't know me, my name is Dale. I'm an engineer for IBM. And I'm going to be talking about what we teach children. I have an interest in education. Definitely a layperson. You know, I'm by no means a teacher. I'm not a proper educator in any way. I'm married to a teacher, so I get to spectate. And I've got friends who are teachers, and they all seem to work a lot harder than me. But my goal for this talk is to try and look, as technologists, what kind of perspective can we bring? You know, if schools are about trying to prepare children for the jobs of tomorrow, getting them ready for the world of tomorrow they're going into, as technologists, we have a perspective of what that world of tomorrow is going to look like. And that's kind of what I want to do this morning, is to sort of look at how have schools responded to technology trends, looking back at, you know, how schools have changed what they teach, and then using what we understand about tech, projecting forwards and looking to see what do we think schools need to be doing, and where do we think there's an opportunity for change. That's kind of where I'm going to be coming at it. And spoilers, you know, my main conclusion I'm going to be heading towards for the next 15, 20 minutes is that schools aren't teaching enough about AI, that schools need to be getting more involved and more active and getting more interested in artificial intelligence. Because I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience, AI is already everywhere. We are using AI everywhere, whether that's in controversial places. If you look at the way that law enforcement is doing things like predictive policing, in surprising places, if you look at recruitment, now using AI to screen and sift through CVs. But even the obvious places, like if you look at how banking uses AI for fraud detection, where maybe that's a bit more expected, of course they are, and we'd expect nothing less. Making predictions about tech is always a bit brave, but I don't think it's particularly brave to say when our children leave school, they're going to end up using AI. Whichever career they go into, whatever industry they go into, they're going to end up using AI somehow. And schools have always had to prepare children for the technology that will impact them. And I'm using tech really loosely and really broadly. If you look at email as an example, email is a ubiquitous technology today, right? It drives businesses in every industry. So for years now, schools have had to not just teach children how to use email, but they've had to prepare them for the risks. And I've also been using AI to come up with my slides as well. Some of them are a bit weirder than others. For years now, even the most tech-phobic, tech-disinterested student has left school understanding that not just how to send and receive email, but understanding they shouldn't open random attachments that they receive. Schools needed to prepare children for a world of work where email was becoming a core ubiquitous tool. Well, AI is becoming core and ubiquitous. So we need children to understand the risks, the implications of this tech. So that's essentially what I want to talk about today. I want to cover three questions. What I think we need to be teaching, and sort of part of that, you know, who do we need to cover this with? When I think we need to start. And I want to show you some examples of how I think we could do this, and some of the work that I've been doing with schools to help get started with this. But I'm going to start with the what. What do we need to be teaching? So I said that I want to frame this in terms of like looking at how education has responded to technology trends in the past. So democratization of technology. This is the term we use to describe how, as technologies evolve, they become accessible to more people. So I picked a couple of examples to help us illustrate this. Printing, printing and publishing in general is a really nice example of this. Because in medieval times, creating a book was a manual process. It was the work of trained experts, like monks in monasteries in the scriptorium, who would craft these beautiful handwritten Bibles. And if you look back then, we weren't teaching children to read and write. But we didn't need to, because most children were never going to own a book. You needed wealth to own a book. At best, children could go to a church and have a book read to them. But technology evolved. The creation of the printing press in the 15th century led to the mass production of books. And it wasn't just a one-off thing. You know, if you look over the next hundreds of years, like the development of paper mills in the 19th century that made the production of printed materials more affordable. Technology evolved. Printing technology became democratized. And schools responded. We started teaching children to read and write, in part because businesses were exploiting these technologies. It set an expectation for education. But it didn't stop there. It wasn't a one-off thing. It's a continual evolution. The introduction of typewriters in the late 19th century made the production of standardized documents faster and cheaper. Typing became this essential skill in the workplace. We invented jobs, office and secretarial jobs that didn't exist before in response to the technology. Schools responded by teaching typing classes. It didn't stop there. Digital technologies replaced typewriters. Word processors gave everyone the tools to produce beautiful documents. This influenced every industry. Every industry needs to produce documents, leaflets, posters, brochures. Schools responded by teaching word processing and desktop publishing. This is the era I went to school in. I remember being taught Word and Publisher because they were emerging technologies that were impacting industry. Evolution continued. The internet replaced the need for some printed documents, enabled instant publication of any content. This transformed the industry. I don't need to tell this audience the impact the internet has had on industry, right? Every industry needs to publish online. But what did schools do? They responded by starting to teach the languages and tools for creating web pages. This is the era my kids went to school in. Democratization of technology, the evolution of a technology so that it becomes increasingly accessible to broader swathes of the population. Printing and publishing is just one example. This evolution has been repeated for technology after technology. And as this happens, education has always needed to respond to that evolution by changing what we teach children. This is the lens that I want to look at AI through. So for those of you who don't know me, I work at IBM. My office was in this building until last year, but now I work in a building off to the side that isn't as fancy, but this makes for a better photo. But also the one thing I like about working at Hursley Park is the history. It gives me a context to talk about history because we moved into the site in 1958. And we have a museum on site with some of the history of the site. And I love searching around that stuff because in some of the earliest photos we have of the site from back then, you can see photos like this, computers being created and used by experts in white lab coats. Computing was an exclusive field. Computing was a specialist domain needing specialist skills. And that has changed over time. I mean, my degree is computer science. I don't feel like a scientist. I don't think of myself as a scientist. But that's where we've come from, treating computing as this specialist exclusive field. In the 1940s, the chairman of IBM made, well, did he make this quote? I've been looking for this quote that the world would only ever need 5 computers. I've searched for primary sources to back this up and I can't find it. So it's possible he didn't actually say this at all, but it's kind of become this ubiquitous thing now. And it's not just that one. You can find loads of examples, like the founder of DEC in the 70s saying that there was no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. It was enough to teach children that computers existed. But computing evolved. Computers became pervasive. Computers became this thing that anyone could use. All industries started using computers. All industries were transformed by computers. And not just technologists like us. The spreadsheet became a key business tool. Millions of office workers around the world, they don't think of themselves as programmers. Business people I know who express surprise at how we can write code, you know, that they describe it as gobbledygook for nerds. And I look at what they do in Excel, these crazy macros and functions and expressions that are way more complex than anything. Basically, they are programmers. We just have better tools than them. Much better. Schools taught children to use tools like Excel because they would need to use technology like it. But this continued, this evolved. If you look at, the rise of the internet startup, companies like WhatsApp, Instagram, WordPress, not just websites, things like Minecraft, they're big now, but they all started with just a few people. That ability of computing no longer needing hundreds of programmers, no longer needing those experts in white lab coats, being something that any of us can put a dent in the world if we know how to code. Schools responded by teaching coding. They started teaching children how to use a computer to make something new. They started teaching children how to make a computer do something by describing what they wanted in code. Schools have always responded by changing what they teach children about technology in response to how far the technology is in this evolution. But as a technology evolves like this, how do we decide what we need to teach to all children? How do we decide what we can just teach to the older students, the ones who choose to specialize in that tech? Well, I think the key factor is how ubiquitous that technology will be across how many industries. This is the tech for replacing the transcatheter aortic valve. It's completely transformed heart surgery. I barely know that this exists. I certainly don't need to know how it works. As a technology, yes, it's been transformative. Yes, the usage of it has increased, but the usage of it has been restricted to a particular specific domain. So we haven't needed to teach all children about it. Well, AI isn't like that. AI isn't going to be used only in one field. It isn't going to be restricted to one domain. AI is not only going to be used in one industry. Every industry is going to find transformative ways to apply artificial intelligence. And not just the industries like ours, not just the knowledge workers. I mean every industry. If you look at car mechanics as an example, modern cars, I found stories quoting that modern cars run on over 100 million lines of code. I'm not sure how much I believe that. I wonder how much of that is just libraries and Linux and stuff. But I think it's reasonable to say that there is a lot of technology in modern cars. They are basically a computer on wheels. The amount of data that a car mechanic can get from a car is a crucial part of their job now. Well, a large amount of structured data ready for analysis to help you work out how to fix something. Can you think of a use case that's better suited to AI? AI is going to become a crucial part of diagnostics and maintenance. Or farmers. Farming is already quite technical. Farmers use software to monitor and optimize things like crop growth, irrigation, fertilization. But AI will bring a shift from monitoring to predicting. They'll start predicting things like the best time to plant and harvest crops. I could give you examples for any industry. The point is, we need schools to get to the teach them to make with it end with AI. It's not going to be enough for schools to stay at the acknowledging it exists end. But when? When do we need to do this? How far along should we be now? Where is AI on this evolution timeline? Well, AI started in the 1950s. Speech recognition systems were being made in the 60s. Self-driving cars started in the 80s. Predictive systems in the 90s. 2011, Apple created Siri to recognize commands. Consumer-facing text classification. AI is not new. AI is not futuristic. You don't need a degree in computing to build an AI anymore. You certainly don't need a white lab coat. Education needs to get more involved. It's time for education to get involved. Even ChatGPT, which Dylan's already mentioned, but has absolutely got the public's attention in a way that AI hasn't really grabbed the public before. Now, some have suggested that we should be teaching children to use tools like ChatGPT. I think that's kind of reasonable, because absolutely, I think tools like it will become standard tools by the time our children leave school. ChatGPT or some technology like it will become that Excel of the future, that tool that enables millions of otherwise non-technical people who don't think of themselves as programmers, to use computers to do amazing things. But I worry about the impact it's having. I went to an education conference. It was mainly like teachers, educators, code club volunteers, that sort of people. And it was fantastic to see how often ChatGPT got mentioned by people who aren't developers, who aren't techies, who aren't immersed in this stuff, but they'd heard of ChatGPT. Most of them had tried it, they were aware of it. But in some ways, my hesitation comes from the same people who a few years ago were saying we can't just call computing education, teaching people to use Excel and PowerPoint and Word, are now saying we can teach people about AI by letting them play with GPT. And I worry that we can't just teach people to become passive users of this technology. We need children to be the makers and the builders, because I think that's how they understand it. So I do think they should understand what GPT can do, and I do think teaching them to use it makes sense because it's going to become a standard tool, but I don't think we can stop there. Education needs to catch up. This is a cliche, but if Steve Jobs could use it, then I figure I can get away with it too. Skate to where the puck is going. Because when I say education needs to catch up, what I mean is education needs to skate to where AI is going. And AI is moving fast. The need for understanding how to use AI tools is in industry now. It's here today. People who know how to use AI tools are outperforming people who don't today. Now, schools can't help with that. Schools need to be looking to where we're going next. We need to get to the teach them to make with it end. So what do I think we need to do? We need to teach children what AI is. We need to teach them what the tech can do so they can identify the opportunities for the new apps and the new systems and the new projects that they're going to create. We need to teach them how the tech behaves. So even the ones who aren't going to be as hands-on can recognize the risks, can recognize where there's a need for oversight as a society. We need them to know how AI projects are created, so they get to understand the motivations and the behaviors of the companies that are applying them. I've been creating AI resources for schools for about 6 years now, and in my experience, the best way to do this is to give students AI tech to make stuff with. Let them get firsthand, let them learn how this stuff behaves by building with it. I often get school kids to use a computer game as the basis for creating their first AI. They play a game, they collect all of the moves that they make, and they use those moves to train their own artificial intelligence project. They're training an AI to play a game by using their own playing to create the training data. Now, some of my students are impatient. They're eager to test their project. Their AI control character tends to play really, really badly because with only a small number of training examples, their AI control character might not have even learned to navigate the maze, and it gets stuck in a corner. Or it can get stuck against a wall and not know how to navigate around it. But that's okay, because they go back and they do more training. They collect more examples of themselves playing. And with a few more examples, their AI control character learns to navigate the maze, and then still quickly gets caught by the enemy. So they go back and they do more training. They collect more and more examples of themselves playing. And with a few more examples, their AI control character starts to play well. By the end of the lesson, they've collected loads of training examples, and some see their AI control character able to evade the enemy forever. Now, what these children learn from this is the correlation between the amount of training data and the accuracy of an AI system. This is a crucial principle in applying AI tech. The more data you have to train with, the better it tends to perform. Children can learn this for themselves, discover that through their own projects, noticing how they improve as they add more training examples. And learning this, realizing this, opens their eyes to how companies need to find opportunities to collect training data for AIs. They start to notice things. They notice how a company could get billions of people to label training examples, like examples of photos of things they might need a self-driving car to learn to recognize, for example. Another project I've helped students make is their own virtual assistant, something like an Amazon Alexa. they trained their own AI project to recognize commands by writing examples of how they would phrase those commands. And I give them time to play an experiment so they can test it out. They can see what it recognizes correctly and what trips it up. My favorite example for a favorite lesson I saw when I was doing this is I had one student who asked their AI to activate the spinny thing as a way of asking to turn on a fan, which is just inspired. I loved that. Their AI didn't understand that, and it turned on a lamp instead. So I asked them how they could fix that. What could they do about that? And they said that if they added activate the spinny thing to their training examples for the turn on the fan command, then their AI would learn to recognize commands like that in the future. That's a really good answer. But with a little bit of prompting, they started talking about collecting everything their project got wrong, collecting all of those mistakes and adding all of those mistakes to their training. They realized by themselves how this would make their project get better and better at recognizing commands the more that they used it. With a little understanding about how AI technologies behave, that's a natural and an obvious thing to do. I've seen hundreds of children come to that same realization. But when Amazon was reported to be doing something like that, the news media was surprised. Tech journalists wrote countless articles about how shocked they were that an AI team might want to do something like this. Primary school students that I've worked with not only easily understand the motivation, but often suggest similar approaches by themselves. Now, I'm not saying that all school children think something like Amazon's actions are totally fine. Most school classes I've led have been mixed on that issue. Some students think it was reasonable, other students think it was inappropriate, and I've watched classes have fantastic debates on this. The crucial thing is they're debating it in the context of an understanding of the technology and an understanding of the motivation of the companies running these systems. That is what we need to be enabling. I'll give you one last example. I love projects where students can see AIs get things wrong, because I think they learn a lot from that through that kind of experimentation. I try and find use cases that make sense to them, that feel relevant to them. I do a lot of, particularly recently, I've been doing a lot of classes around Pokemon. I know nothing about Pokemon. I've learned a lot about them from classes I've taught. In this project, they're training a machine learning model to classify what type of Pokemon a Pokemon is based on what it looks like. So you could show it you could show it a picture of a Pokemon and it will tell you that's a rock one or an electric one or whatever. And then we make games where we give it a Pokemon and it classifies it. I should do this as a test. Does anyone know what type Blaziken actually is? Yes. The machine learning model came up with electric. It gets it wrong. And often students' first reaction is they assume AI is this modern, futuristic tech. And the idea that it makes a mistake really surprises them. So you get them to think about it though. You say, well, why do you think it came up with electric? Look at what you've taught it. Look at how you've trained it. Why do you think it thought electric? And it's speculation, right? Because we can't really tell for sure, but even a primary school kid will look at that and think for a bit and say, well, there's a lot of yellow in it. And looking at all the electric Pokemon, a lot of them, like Pikachu, are yellow. A lot of the electric Pokemon have these jagged edges, like lightning bolt style shapes. And if you look at his feet, it's a bit small, so some of you might not be able to see, but there's a lot of jagged yellow shapes in there. Maybe it learned to recognize that jagged yellow shapes often means electric, and that's why it thought that's electric. I mean, that's the kind of answer I'm getting from 7, 8-year-olds. And it shows an understanding of the tech that I love. Another one, Magikarp. Anyone want to guess what type of Pokemon that actually is? It's water, exactly. It's a fish, that's the clue. But it's red. And if you look at the fire ones, a lot of the fire Pokemon are red. So again, I've had students sort of suggest that, well, maybe I trained the machine to think that red Pokemon are normally associated with fire. This idea of computers learning from patterns they can find in data, but that's not necessarily the pattern you wanted it to learn, is really important. When we look at how AI is applied and the impact it's going to have on society, having the next generation have that level of understanding of how the tech behaves, I think is going to be crucial. If you look at, even recently, the mistakes that we make with AI, there was an article a year or so ago about, it was a review of all the machine learning projects in the response to COVID. And some of the mistakes we were making were shocking. I saw write-ups of projects where, like looking at scans of chest scans, and to try and be able to identify from a chest scan if someone has COVID or not. So they were scrabbling to try and find training data in a hurry because there wasn't much in the early days. So long story short, what they ended up finding was all of their scans they trained with patients who were really seriously ill with COVID, they were too ill to stand up, they were lying down. All their healthy chest scans they had, or a lot of them, were patients who were stood up. And the way the organs lie when you're laid on your back versus when you're stood up is different. So what the machine learning model learned was that if you're laid down, you've got COVID. If you're stood up, you haven't. These are the kinds of mistakes that even a primary school kid can start to get their head around once they've started playing around with the tech for themselves. I think what I've found over the last 6 years that children, even at a primary school age, can understand the core principles of artificial intelligence projects if they're given access to the tech in a familiar sandbox and the time to experiment. They can understand what the tech can do, and their natural creativity means they come up with all sorts of really fun ideas for building with it. They can understand enough about how the tech behaves to recognize the risks and to engage in debates about the need for oversight. They don't use phrases like AI ethics, but they have an innate sense of fairness and justice that takes them a long way in understanding the issues. That first-hand experience in creating AI projects for themselves shows them enough about how AI projects are made to give them a bit of an insight into the motivations and the behaviors of the companies that are applying them at scale. We need to be doing this now. We don't teach them to drive without making sure they understand enough about how cars work to use them safely. We teach them those risks of email I mentioned before because we know that when they go into work, they're going to be using email. We teach them the risks of social media because we know they're going to grow up using that, so we know we need to prepare them. Well, as I've kept saying, they are going to be using AI. AI is going to play a major transformative role, whatever industry they go into. AI is going to impact their lives. It'll impact what job they can get, what bank loan and mortgages they get approved for, what news they get, and so much more besides. They're going to grow up using AI systems we can only dream of today. We need to make sure they're prepared for that. We need to demand that understanding artificial intelligence is a fundamental part of every student's education. Thank you for listening.
There's one elementary school I know of where AI is very prolific, and that's South Park Elementary. I don't know if you've seen that before. This great episode of South Park this year called Deep Learning. Has anyone seen it? It's probably the best 20-minute explanation of AI to someone who hasn't used it before out there. It's co-authored by ChatGPT, the episode of South Park. And it's like this really concise explanation of the kids explaining how to use ChatGPT for like their school assignments and to respond to their girlfriend's texts in meaningful ways and stuff. And it's really quite funny. So I recommend it. But anyway, we have time for a couple questions if anyone has one for Dale.
So for people who didn't hear, essentially, how do we do what I was saying? There's different aspects to it. There's firstly in terms of giving the tools, making the tools available to schools. As I think other talks are going to cover today, the amount of amazingly powerful AI you can do in the browser nowadays is huge. Like there are TensorFlow.js is ridiculously powerful. You can do stuff in the browser that I was doing 10, 15 years ago on massive racks of servers. So, and a lot of the stuff that I was showing, this is a web app that I made. This is using an extension to Scratch. So schools that have web browsers, have access to the tools we can use. The next thing is about the skills, preparing teachers so they're comfortable to explain this stuff in school. That is tricky. I spend a lot of time working with schools and with groups that support schools. There is a lot more, so particularly with Raspberry Pi Foundation, I've worked with them. We've produced a whole ton of resources that is ready for schools to bring into the classroom. So I think that is getting better, but it's still tricky, and it's a whole new area that a lot of teachers don't feel comfortable explaining. So I think that's something we need to do more about. And I think that's an area where we can all help. As technologists, if we're, there's always an opportunity to volunteer in your local school or your local code club. Organizations like Coder Dojo or Code Club, both run by Raspberry Pi Foundation, are always looking for volunteers. Your local library, your local community center, your local school. I think the third aspect is about time. The challenge I hear from a lot of teachers is we've got the curriculum, we have to pack all of this in, and it's really hard to fit it into the week as it is. AI isn't in the curriculum, so how do we make room for it? I think that's where we need essentially our leaders, our MPs, our legislators to make room for it. Other ways I found that helps with that is to not make AI lessons AI for the sake of AI, but to fit it into the rest of the lesson. Chatbots are a nice way of doing that. So pick whatever topic the class is currently doing. Romans, Vikings, history, a good one, geography. And we train a chatbot to answer questions on that topic. So that from their perspective, it's a geography lesson. We've just snuck a bit of AI in there. In the same way that when kids write a report on something, they're learning about how to use a word processor to structure and present information, but they think it's it's not as obvious. Or if they get to do a presentation, they're learning about how to use PowerPoint or Keynote, but it's subtle. You fitting AI into existing curriculums as just another way to interact with data, I find helps. But yeah, there's tons of challenges. Even in 6 years, I've seen it get better, but there's still more that we need to do.
All right. One more question or move on?
I'm around for the rest of the day, so
Yes.
if anyone wants me to show them things they can take into their, to share with their kids or to take into their local schools, I've got dozens of projects like this I can get you started with.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks a lot.